Good evening. Welcome to our Maundy Thursday devotional. When we gather in person or virtually to celebrate Maundy Thursday, we're commemorating Jesus' last meal with his disciples. I think sometimes we forget that they sat down to a real meal. We focus so much sometimes on Jesus introducing the sacrament of Holy Communion that maybe sometimes we just think of there being sort of a loaf of bread and a cup of wine and nothing else. But they sat down to a real meal. And in fact, probably had some of these very same items there. It was a Passover meal, and so they would have certainly had lamb and some sort of greens or bitter herbs. They had, we know, wine and bread. And although it doesn't mention it specifically, here are stewed beans, which was a very common, popular dish at the time. That wasn't part of a traditional Seder meal, but it's unclear if they were in the middle of a formal Seder or if they had. I don't want to get off on a tangent, but here are some elements that may very well have been present at that meal. There were two things that happened during that dinner, and usually we look at one or the other, but this year I want to invite us to look for a moment at both of them and to consider, perhaps for the first time, what they mean when taken together instead of separately. John records for us that at one point Jesus gets up and takes off his outer robe, and he wraps a towel around his waist, and he fills a basin with water, and he goes around to the disciples and washes their feet and dries them with a towel wrapped around his waist. And that's a remarkable thing for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that it was incredibly humbling for everyone involved. You know, when you read the story, Peter doesn't even want to let Jesus touch his feet. It was humbling for Peter, but even more so for Jesus. That was usually servants' work. In fact, usually one of the lower servants, because people's feet were disgusting, even more so than they are now. You know, people walked everywhere back then and shared the roads with animals. So it was gross work. But Jesus humbles himself, washes their feet, and then he tells them, I've done this to set an example. He tells them that you also, if your master and Lord has washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. And he goes on to say that a servant is not greater than their master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent them. And so John records that moment of humility and that setting of a standard of serving one another that Jesus does at that meal. Matthew, Mark, and Luke focus instead on starting the tradition of Holy Communion. They record for us that during the meal, Jesus took a loaf of bread and he broke it after blessing it, and he offered it to them. He told them to take it and to eat it. And he told them that it was his body that would be broken for them. And they tell us also that Jesus took a cup of wine and he offered to them after blessing it, and he told them to share it, to do it in remembrance of me. Well, not me, but him, because it was his blood that was poured out for a new covenant, for the forgiveness of sins. So they took the bread and the wine, they ate them, not really understanding yet what that meant. But it started a tradition that became one of the cornerstones of Christian worship from the beginning of the church. And in fact, in the early centuries of the church, they would gather together as a community, and they would have a time of teaching and singing and worshiping, and then they would all sit down to a meal together. And as the church spread and incorporated new geographical areas, they would have incorporated new foods as well. And you'd see more fish as you moved into the Mediterranean and those sorts of things. But like that first meal, they sat down to an actual meal together, and they broke bread and shared a cup. They repeated Jesus' words. And to this very day, we've dropped the rest of the meal. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe it wasn't practical to try to do a full meal as the church grew and you had these huge churches that couldn't sit everybody. Maybe we should think about starting that. Maybe we should go back to, well, once COVID's over, maybe that's what happened. Maybe the Black Plague shut that whole thing down when people couldn't gather that way anymore. But when COVID's over, maybe we should think about having whole meals for communion again. I think there's something meaningful about that. But that was a mainstay, a hallmark of the church, to gather, to fellowship, to eat together, and to commemorate Jesus' sacrifice through the sacrament of Holy Communion over a meal. Those are two separate stories. They're contained in different Gospels. And because of that, we usually only look at one or the other. But I think there's something interesting about looking at both together. See, because Jesus told them that he was setting an example when he washed their feet. He told them that they weren't greater than he was, that they should follow the example that he set, that they should do for each other what he did for them. And then he went on to institute this commemoration of the breaking of his body and the shedding of his blood. See, because our sacrament of Holy Communion is about coming together as a community. It's about breaking bread and sharing a cup together. But at the heart of it, it's also very much about Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, about the actual breaking of his body and shedding of his blood. And when we look at those two stories together, I think there's a distinct challenge for us. That as we celebrate Maundy Thursday, and as we celebrate communion over and over throughout our Christian life, somewhere in the back of our minds, we should hear the challenge to follow Jesus' example. And that's not to say that all of us should be crucified. We don't all have the power to forgive sin by our sacrifice. But Jesus was willing to lay down his life for his disciples, for his friends. And he told them they should follow his example. He told them that they weren't greater than him, that they should do for each other the same things that he did for them. When we take communion together, it should be a meaningful, special time of connection with each other and with God, but it should also be a challenge to us to be willing to lay down our lives for each other, to bring healing, to bring redemption, to bring restoration, to help each other grow closer to our Creator. I hope that as you celebrate today, you'll find a meaningful way to commemorate Christ's sacrifice. And I hope that as you do, you'll feel challenged to lay down your lives for one another. Amen.
This is my body This is my blood is shed for you. Take the cup and remember. Take the cup and remember. I came to give that you might live. My life is given for you. Take, eat, this is my body. Take, eat, this is my blood. Oh, come to the feast and remember. My life is given for you. This is my body.